Welcome back. My name is Masood Ramandi and I'm happy to do another session. We have covered different aspects of grace. We have looked at what it means and when it was given and all those good things. We looked at the opposite of grace being the law and what it means to be under the law and then under grace. But anytime that grace is preached, whether it would be from the very first person that preached it, Jesus Christ himself, or from Paul who got a revelation of grace and began to preach grace, or even anyone else after basically Paul who began to build on that revelation and teach about God's grace, there has always been an objection toward grace that wants to limit grace. And that's because mainly a few verses that are in the scriptures and there are gray areas around those. One of them is the judgment seat of Christ. This is in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where actually it indicates that there is going to be a judgment in a place called the judgment seat of Christ, and that's where, according to the good and evil done in the body, it seems to be saying that you would either be rewarded or punished. First, let's look at this and understand if this is really true. Look at chapter 5 of 2 Corinthians and in verse 10. For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that each may receive the things done in the body according to what he has done, whether good or bad. The word bad is evil. So let me just say this, that just based on looking at this and the first impression that we receive from this verse, if we take what it says, we are no different than those who were under the old covenant. Why? Because the old covenant was based on a law that would set the standard. And according to whether you would obey that law or disobey, or basically abide by the law or violate or transgress that law, you would either be blessed or cursed. So there was always a dual, basically, outcome based on what you do. So if that is what we understand from this verse, there is nothing different. Jesus has done nothing. His death means nothing. His resurrection means nothing. His blood means nothing. And still we are in a sowing and reaping type of covenant. We are still in a place that what you do matters. Not that I'm saying that what you do doesn't matter, but what I'm trying to say is it's different now. Now what you do matters because it brings you or it helps you to walk in who you are. That's a different story than the old mentality that was do to become, to get. And this is entirely different. But now let's look at what it says and what this means. The word, I'm going to actually switch over to my screen to write something here we can all benefit from. So the word judgment seat that we just looked at, judgment seat. In the Greek, this is the word bema. Okay, it simply means a seat or a step, a place that someone sits. For example, Herod, when he wanted to make a judgment, he would sit on that place. There are multiple usage of this one in the book of Acts when Paul is brought to judgment or basically constantly being accused. He is being judged before that seat. Now, what I wanted to say is for the word judgment, this word judgment, we have the true judgment, because I said this is just simply a seat. But the word in the Greek for judgment is the noun form would be krisis or krima, or the verb form of that would be krino. Okay, so these all are different basically impression of judgment. Okay, now this judgment seat has nothing to do with this. As I said, this is simply a seat where basically the guilty appears, and that judgment is done in that place. Now, let's look at what's the context of 2 Corinthians chapter 5. First of all, where we are. Let me just put it here. We are actually talking about, we are in 2 Corinthians 5, and this is in verse 10. Okay, so this is a good good principle to abide by, to actually understand how to interpret or how to understand something, a subject, a topic in the Bible. And that's looking at basically what is the context, what is before and what is after. Or in other words, look at what things have sandwiched this specific verse. Look at what we read before this. Before this story, we have two parts. We have 2 Corinthians chapter 3 and chapter 4. And after this, all right. So we have 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17, if I'm not, yes, verse 16 to 21. Now, let me show you what actually these are talking about. Chapter 3 and 4 are all about Old Covenant versus New Covenant. Okay, chapter 3 and chapter 4. Let me just give you a few examples. Chapter 3, verse 5 and 6, Paul says, we are not ministers of the old covenant. We are not ministers of the letter of the law, but we are the ministers of the Spirit. We are the ministers of the new covenant. And then it says, because the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And then he goes on to say in verse 7, the ministration of the old covenant was the ministration of condemnation and death. Okay, so its judgment would always lead into condemnation and death. So, but then he comes to say, well, look at what we have now. We have the ministration of the Spirit that gives life. That means the judgment that it brings, it's not to bring death, but it's to bring life. It goes on to say, now we have the Spirit. Now we are beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord in the Spirit, and we are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of God and not by our works. See, this is still a comparison between the two and showing what life in the Spirit looks like and what life in the flesh, according to the letter of the law, according to a carnal mind, looked like. But then he comes in chapter 4 to say, but this gospel is so good, but it's being veiled to some people. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 3 says, even if our gospel is veiled, it's veiled to those who are perishing. So it says that this good news that is so good that we say it and people immediately bring a veil upon it, it's just because, their own heart and their own mind can't grasp the magnitude or the largeness of this grace that has been given to us in Christ Jesus. And then he goes on to say, but God is shining his light in verse 6 of chapter 4. And he says, this light comes from the knowledge of the glory of God, and it's from the face of Jesus Christ. So it brought us to the person of Jesus Christ, Christ himself. Now you come eventually in chapter 5 to our verse. Now we have the judgment seat of Christ. Okay, I don't want to say anything about this. So we covered the first layer of this sandwich. Now we want to go to the second. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 16 and 17. It says in verse, actually, let me show you what it says in verse 14. It says, for the love of Christ compels us, because we judge thus. It says it's the love of Christ that is the foundation of our judgment. Okay, that's very important. That's very important because you can do judgment from any place. You can make a judgment out of anger. You can make a judgment out of frustration. You can make a judgment out of unforgiveness. But Paul says, we judge thus, and this is, it says, what proceeds or precedes this, and that is that the love of Christ compels us. It's the love of God, the love of Christ that actuates us, that drives us to judge like this. Okay, now what is that judgment? If one died for all died. Okay, and then he goes on to say, and he died, verse 15, and he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and rose again. What does that mean? Verse 16, from now on, we regard no one according to the flesh. Oh, okay. So it says, now I tell you the truth. The judgment seat upon which you sit, first of all, must be from the love of Christ. And second of all, that love and that place that you're sitting and judging will never judge anyone according to the flesh. What does that mean? It will judge them according to the Spirit. Now, what does that mean? If one died, all died. Okay, what does that mean? That means who you see them to be will create in them the effect of God's judgment. Because God's judgment is out of love. Okay, so it says, now, aren't you the minister of the new covenant? Yes, you are. Didn't Paul say in chapter 3 before this, in the first layer, that the ministration of the Spirit, the new covenant, is the ministration of the Spirit? Yes, he said. Didn't he say the ministration of the Spirit is the ministration of life and not death? Yes, he did. So then, what is this judgment seat of Christ? Well, let me now show you. Let's go back to verse 9. Because now I'm going to, not the layer anymore, I'm going to, not to the bread, I'm going to the meat actually, that is between these two layers. Now look at what he says in verse 9. Therefore, we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him, for we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Okay, let's understand what this means. In order to do this, I actually need you to take you to this verse in concordance. So let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 9. Because we want to know this when he says, this is King James. Let me change that to New King James. Verse 9. For we make it our aim. What does that mean, we make it our aim? Does that really mean this is our goal? No. Let's look at what it means in the Greek. And to be well-pleasing to him. Again, what does that mean? Well, let's just check every word in this context. Look at what was translated in New King James as we make it our aim, which in King James is being translated as we labor. It's this word. It's hard to pronounce, but I think should be philotimomai, something like that. This is a compound word or a combined word. It comes from two Greek words, and we can find it simply if I just click on this word. It will show you that it's from a compound of these two Greek words. Okay, so this was our word, was translated as we make it our aim, and this is the basically the two words that have made this word. Now these two, I'm going to show you what it means. I'm going to open the first one. This is adjective, and it means friend, to be friendly to one, to wish him well, a friend, an associate. So it's about friendship, it's about love. Okay, now let's look at the second one. Okay, timei. This means a valuing by which the price is fixed. I mean, the literal translation would be honor. Okay, the value. I'm going to show you. Actually, if you check here, it says that the King James translates this word 35 times to honor, 8 times into price. So the main, basically, the better translation would be honor. So now let's go back. So we are dealing with two words. One means love or friendship or friend, and the other one means honor. And now let's read the meaning according to concordance itself. It says to be fond of honor. Okay, what word this was? It was the word that was translated, we make it our aim. But this one is different than what the translation says. It says to be, if you want to look at the Greek, it means to be fond of honor, to be actuated by love of honor. To be actuated by love of honor. That's like to be compelled by love. To live from a place of honor and not dishonor. I think everyone who has lived in dishonor can understand what this means. From a place of value. Now let's go one step further and basically see the rest of this verse. So it says, therefore, we are actuated by the love of honor. We are fond of honor, that whether present or absent. Now this word, we may be, here it says we may be well-pleasing to him, sounds like saying that we strive, as King James says, to please God. Well, this is different. What actually we are reading is different. It says this word, we may be, let's show what it means. I'm going to close these two. So we may be is actually to be present, to exist. So it's a state of being. Now let me take you back. I put all this together. Don't worry, don't be overwhelmed. So it says that we be present, exist as someone that is the pleasure of the Lord, as someone that has pleased him. Now let me from the beginning go back and translate according to what the Greek would tell us. It says, therefore, we are actuated by the love of this honor that is being bestowed on us, to exist as someone that is well-pleasing to God. Not to do, to become. To exist as someone who has pleased God. Sounds like what Jesus heard before doing anything. When he came out of a baptism and he heard the voice that said, you are my son, in you I am well pleased. Before doing anything, before healing the sick, before casting out demons, before preaching the gospel, before laying down his life, before any of that, he heard that actually he received this honor from basically the Father. He knew who he was. In fact, I will quickly show you this in 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 17 says, for he received from God the Father honor and glory, when such a voice came from him from the excellent glory, this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. So it says, now this, we're talking about a life that is being actuated by the love of honor. What honor is that? For us to be called sons of God. So now that's what brings us to the next verse that says we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. That brings us to the judgment seat of Christ. Now, so you get the context. You saw the first layer, the bread below, you saw the bread on the top, and now I'm showing you what is actually the meat in between. And that is that we must all appear before judgment seat of Christ. Now, the word appear seems to be saying that there is one day that there is going to be a seat, a chair, and Jesus is going to be sitting there, and you will go there. And just like movies that we have, maybe he has Peter before him, that Peter says, okay, let me just open the book, because they read that also from Revelation chapter 20, that books were open and they were judged according to the things that were written in the books. So that's the picture that we have. And Peter says, okay, let me see what you have done while you were on earth. This is what you have done, and this is, what you haven't. And then there is judgment seat of Christ, and judgment is made. Either you go to hell or you go to heaven. Well, this can't be farther from the truth. Now, here, what we read is not appearing in future. It's a present reality, and it's not appearing, it's a manifestation. So it says, for we must manifest before the judgment seat of Christ. That means who you are must be before the seat of Christ and not the seat of man. That's the context. I just said that I will show you, because this concept is all over the epistles, especially basically 2 Corinthians and Romans. I will show you actually what Romans says about this. And also in the book of John, this whole thing about judgment according to man and judgment according to God. Paul, for example, before this, here we read in verse 9 that says, therefore we make it our aim, whether present or absent, to be well-pleasing to him. And I showed you actually how it should read, but let's just take this part, well-pleasing to him. It's not, the emphasis is not well-pleasing to him, it's him. It's well-pleasing to him. That's the context. That's in contrast to man, because man has been trying to, or especially, the context of the Old Covenant, they have always tried to be well-pleasing to each other. That means to the religious leaders. That means everything that they did was toward basically pleasing the leaders. That's why even you read in the Gospels by the things that Jesus said. He said, when you do pray, when you do fast, when you do alms, don't do it before men. So what was he saying? Don't put yourself in a place to be judged by men. You can never truly manifest who you are before the judgment seat of men. But before the judgment seat of Christ, you manifest as who you are. What is that? Well, he said, the love of Christ compels me. This is the judgment seat of Christ. The love of Christ compels me that if he died, all are dead, all died. And if someone is died, I'm not going to judge them because they're dead. You can't judge a dead person, but you can judge a living person. And he says, now, the one who is raised from the dead, if we died and we raised with him, then this is the kind of judgment that we are going to have. We ourselves are a new creation, and our judgment is going to be from the place of new creation. New creation doesn't judge like the old creation. Otherwise, what's the point of all these things? If we as Christians who say we are new creations, if we judge the same way that we used to, if our standards is the same thing, if the law that we abide by is the law of the Old Covenant, if our standards are the standards of the Old Covenant, if our mindset is Old Testament, if the letter of the law is what we use to judge, then what's the difference? What kind of newness we have? Nothing. But it says, therefore, let me show you, the judgment seat of Christ in the context is not to say, it's not to emphasize on a truth called one day to be appearing before this judgment seat and be judged by Christ. It says, no, this is in fact to show you this person is different than anybody else that you have ever stood before. You have stood in courts, before judgment seats. You have been judged by people. I'm telling you, this is different. This is called the judgment seat of Christ. This is the same throne that is called in Hebrews chapter 4, verse, 16, the throne of grace, that you can go and receive mercy and grace. So it's not a place of judging you, accusing you, and condemning you. In fact, this is a place of bringing out who you are. How does he do it? It compels you that you died. It doesn't compel you to do. It compels you that you have died. No true transformation can happen in a person unless they see they're not the person they used to be. You can't take a person out of a jail and look at them the same way that you used to judge them and expect them not to do the same old thing. You can't bring a thief out of a jail, rescue them, bring them out, and still look at them with their history and expect them to do something different. But if you bring them out of jail and you give them a new identity and you don't ever look at who they used to be, but according to who they have decided to be, a member of this society, a valued member of this society, someone who loves people and who wants to serve and he doesn't want to actually hurt anyone, then that person will live up to that level. So this is how the judgment seat of Christ works. Now, again, let me show you this in the context of Romans, because as I said, this word bema, judgment seat of Christ, let me show you. Okay, so this word bema, or the judgment seat, is used on other than basically what we have in the Gospels and the book of Acts. In the epistles where we have actually revelations, it's used only one more time, and it's in Romans chapter 14, and it's in verse chapter 14, verse 10. Look at what it says. It says, "But why do you judge your brother? Or why do you show contempt for your brother? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ." Okay, let me put it here. We all must stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Okay, and it says, why do you judge? Oh, that's the context. It's not that we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. The context, the emphasis, the point, the thing that you should focus on, the thing that Paul wants to bring home is, why do you judge? Why do you judge the old way? Why do you look at things the old way? Why still regard people according to flesh? Why do you see them in the flesh? Where is the point of you living in a different dimension? Where is the point of you living in the spirit? Where is the point of having eyes that are different than the eyes of the flesh? Where is the point of eyes that can see what the Father shows? Okay, that's the context. But I mean, I think it's already about 30 minutes gone of this teaching, and I don't want to make this longer, but I'm going to have another session, and in that one I will cover the context of judgment seat in Romans chapter 14, so you can once and for all understand what the judgment seat of Christ is, what it means, and get the revelation of that and live by it every day. I'm sure that it will be a blessing, but as I said, these are because I know these are some objections that always come up after preaching or teaching about grace. You teach grace and people say, so does that mean that people are free to sin? So there is always an objection. No matter how clear you teach about grace, there is always that. And obviously we don't say people have license to go sin. We say, if people truly understand grace, sin is not an issue anymore, but righteousness is. And once you get that honor of righteousness, when you are being actuated by the love of honor, I read that verse for you, when they are being driven by the love of honor, when they see that they exist in a place of honor, not to be well-pleasing to God, that they exist in a place of well-pleasing, acceptable to God. They are in that seat, okay? So they're not in the place, in a seat, sitting as the one that is accused. They are actually in a seat that is the seat of honor before Christ himself. Okay, now this I will cover in details in basically next week, but I hope this was clear enough for what 2 Corinthians chapter 5 says. And obviously we will be covering also what it says, the things done in the body, or even I know that there are verses like that God will render to each one according to their works, because that's clear. It says again, once again, God will render to each one according to their works, isn't it? But what works? That's the question. Because if it was, that comes in Romans chapter 2, and Romans chapter 2 is the one that says no one is justified by the works. Okay, so God can never give someone according to their works based on our basically carnal perception. That must mean something. We have to look at what those works are. Okay, that's the context that we need to look at. But then again, thank you for watching this. I'm sure that this would create more points of discussion for you, and I pray that it would be fruitful and you would be a blessing to each other. So I'll see you next week.